behind. When all the world seems in tune, and love goes on softly on. So don't be sighing or crying, dearest winter
Hi, my name is Scudder Kaufman. This is Stephen Attewell.
Steve Attewell.
Yep, and we are going to be doing another Lawyers, Guns, and Money podcast on Game of Thrones. This week's episode is Mockingbird. And why don't you just get us started, Stephen?
Okay, so we start with a scene, sort of, I guess you would call the first scene in kind of a mini play of 3 scenes. This is Tyrion and Jaime, where they are kind of mutually recriminating from the fallout from last week that, Tyrion is telling Jaime that, he gave Tywin everything he wanted without getting much in return. Jaime is pissed off that Tyrion screwed the deal up by kind of letting his emotions get the best of him. And what I like about this scene is it's very grounded in family. I mean, Tyrion is enmeshed in a legal system, but it's also very much a familial legal system because we're in a feudal world. So that, he is as much driven by his desire to, quote, what does he say? It felt good to take that from him. That, at a certain level, he is reacting emotionally out of a desire to hurt his father than he is logically. The other sort of interesting point here is, just for people to keep their eye on, the idea that, Tyrion says you fell in love with a... Sorry, Jaime says to him, you fell in love with a whore, and that's an important thing to keep your eye on in the future.
Yeah, and as you said, it's sort of like the first act in a little 3-act play. And in ways, it's sort of almost the most heartbreaking, because this is the first betrayal, Tyrion's of Jaime, and it's sort of unclear where Jaime stands now, in terms of leaving, the King's Guard and everything that he was promised, and Jaime seems upset that he wasn't allowed to sort of help.
Although notably he declines to help Tyrion in this case, this is kind of, in terms of Tyrion's own position in this episode and their relationship as brothers, it's important that he starts out appealing to his brother. That his brother, as Bronn said, his brothers is always his first choice.
Yeah.
And now that relationship is starting to break down a bit.
A bit. I mean, it really just sort of built up. I mean, it's hard to say that there's that much of a relationship to break down.
Well, except that, as we saw from season 1, Tyrion really did always, has seen Jaime as his protector. His, his big brother who would ride to his rescue. And now he's sort of confronting the fact that even though, Jaime kind of did try to save Tyrion in his own way last episode, that, this is one case in which Jaime is not going to help him.
Yeah, and it was the wrong way. He's sort of relied on Jaime for physical protection, not to out-scheme his father and his sister.
Right.
Speaking of whom, we see her shortly thereafter as we're reintroduced to her protector.
The Mountain.
The Third Mountain.
Is
the
engaged
Mountain Range, we ought to start calling him at this point.
Who is engaged in his normal morning practice, of butchering what appears to be prisoners, seemingly for the exercise of lifting an entire human being up in the air on the end of your great sword.
I mean, it was basically like Benihana's, right? I mean, it was for murdering sociopaths. Stick it on a skewer, put it in the air, throw it around. We did get a sense of his size, though.
Yes, he is massive. His sword is as tall as Cersei is.
Yeah. And there was some great cast pictures, and actually, one of the GMs of the Indianapolis Colts tweeted.
Yes, I didn't know he almost used to be a Colt.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he didn't almost use me. He's like, the guy just tweeted that I was watching Game of Thrones, and holy crap, I tried to recruit that guy, and it's pretty clear why.
Yeah. I mean, I know linebackers are supposed to be, like, beefy, but I didn't know they got that tall.
Yeah, see, I mean, that's part of the problem. He's probably too tall to be a linebacker, and and also sort of too tall to be a defensive lineman because he wouldn't be able to get leverage. But I don't think our listeners want to hear us talk football.
Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting that, even people who spend all day around what we would call physical specimens sort of freaked out when they saw this guy and said, now that's a physical specimen.
Yeah, I mean, he is the strongest man in Iceland, third strongest man in the world. He's 410 pounds. That is kind of and honestly, I think a major improvement over the second guy they cast to be the Mountain. So it's important that they sort of stuck that right before the big fight.
And it's also, I think, important that they stuck it right before the next scene, which is Arya and the Mountain's little brother.
Right.
It's hard to imagine him having a big one, or bigger one. In a very touching scene that,
You didn't feel it went on a little bit long?
Yeah, but sort of as
my sort of thought was, for a guy who supposedly got stabbed and has been like slowly dying of, bleeding / exposure / dehydration, this guy is hanging on for a long time.
Well, he finally has someone to talk to. I mean,
yeah, maybe he's just lonely.
Yeah, and then dead.
Yeah, I mean, the important thing here is they're introducing the concept of the gift of mercy, continuing their slightly dysfunctional kind of mentor-mentee relationship. Arya here learns, the best place to stab somebody to get them in the heart real quick. And then the Hound suddenly gets bitten by Biter.
And she gets to use her new talent. Quick study she is. But also I think it's important that we're being reminded of who Arya Stark was.
Right.
And there's a lot of that in this episode, obviously. But I think that's one of the reasons the scene went on a long time. You want that nothing could be worse than this. Maybe nothing is worse. Maybe nothing is nothing. Right?
Yeah, I just felt that part could have been a little bit streamlined while keeping the main beats.
Probably could have. But dying isn't fun, and dying is something that should be a little uncomfortable and makes you want to look away from. I mean, this is something that the show Louie actually does really, really well. Is just let you sit there with how uncomfortable everything is for a couple of beats too long, and then a couple of beats more too long. And so I'm a little more enamored of that technique now.
Okay. So, I mean, the main thing, with Arya stabbing Rorge is that, we're seeing the elaboration of this code that she has to know your name and add you to her list before she'll kill you. So, clearly, just nobody introduces themselves to Arya and they'll all be fine.
Yeah. The world will be safe from little girls.
Right. And then we move to Castle Black, where Jon Snow returns. Everyone is quite happy, except for Sir Alistair, who is acting like a high school bully again. Mance Rayder's army is a month away. Jon Snow wants to close the tunnel because giants. Sir Alistair sort of bullies the first builder into agreeing with him, and sentences Jon Snow and Sam to a nighttime scenes together. Excuse me, I mean night watch duties.
Well, what struck me about this scene, and this is, I think, the third time this season, it seems like there's a kind of institutional amnesia with John, whereas every time he leaves, people forget he's important, and then he comes back and he has to reestablish himself. You know, I don't know what sort of whisper campaigns go on when he's not there.
I mean, I don't know about that because I think it's more a case of there's a disjuncture between the above and below that you'll notice, like, Jon Snow's popularity among the rank and file doesn't go away. That doesn't need to be reestablished. But it's like every time Sir Alistair has, like, some sort of scheme for how to deal with Jon Snow, and then, like, sends Jon Snow off, and then Jon Snow succeeds because he's obviously competent. Like, he rediscovers all over again how much he dislikes this guy.
Yeah.
So, you know, there is a slight, you know, I said high school bully, but, you know, there is a slight kind of, the sort of
Sonic quality to it, as if these are all little episodes of a, you know, bad TV show from the 90s.
Right. And so now we have the second scene in the Tyrion short play, where Bronn seemingly...
The most painful.
Yes.
I'm going to argue the most painful.
Where Bronn shows up having bathed and changed his clothes for seemingly the first time in his life.
He's looking good.
He is moving on up.
Yeah, but it's so sad. I mean, I think I mentioned ages ago that one of my students for their final project did this great mashup of Bronn and Tyrion walking together to the tune of "So Happy Together."
Yeah.
And this is the end of that relationship. They're breaking up, and it's not me, it's you.
Well, it's not me, it's not you, it's the 8-foot-tall murder machine.
Yeah.
You know, and what I like about it is that it's, you know, as breakups go, it's one based on sort of mutual understanding. That, you know, he basically says, you know, look, one, you really can't outbid Cersei. Like, at a certain point, you are playing a game with no cards. But the other thing being that, you know, he could try to fight the Mountain. You know, basically do what Tyrion is hoping for, which is a sort of a retread of the first trial by combat. But that the Mountain is so big and so strong that one misstep and he's dead. So why take that risk? And, you know, it ends on this kind of bittersweet note that, you know, Bronn clearly hopes that Tyrion's going to survive, and is rooting for him, even if he's not going to do anything about it.
Yeah, we've had some good days together, and then they have that little tender moment where they're holding hands for the last time.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think Tyrion got in one slight jab with the, you know, you and my sister deserve each other.
Mm-hmm.
That was a little bit, and then of course the scene ends with the sort of classic prison shot, right, of the diminished prisoner, in this case diminutive and diminished prisoner, behind the bars, staring forlornly at someone, you know, from the camera's perspective, you know, someone who has freedom, and we go from that scene of entrapment
to
Marine, which I thought was sort of telling.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of unclear as to who the prisoner is, Dario or Dan.
No, I mean, I would say it's almost the opposite, which is like, you know, if Tyrion is, you know, is sort of at the at his nadir, you know, totally hopeless. This is Dany enjoying her position and feeling it much more so. You know, the way that she handles Dario in this scene, in which, you know, he's coming to her, you know, yes, he's coming on very strong by breaking into her apartments, But at the same time, he's still coming as a supplicant. He's still saying, I want to do something, will you let me do it? And, the scene where she asks him to strip is pretty damn unusual for the show, in that this is very much a scene about the female gaze, and about a woman exercising sexual control.
And also, given issues that have been raised in previous weeks about the power dynamics involved in sex, it's a little creepy. Because there's this moment where you get the idea that she realizes, oh, I can just tell anyone I want to take off their clothes, and they will.
Yeah. On the other side, given that Dario is essentially stalking her, it is kind of an interesting power move in and of itself. That she's essentially reasserting control over this relationship and saying, I'm the one who's going to decide where and when you're going to fight, and I'm the one who's going to decide where and when you're going to fuck. And then of course, just because HBO can only go so far in a progressive direction, we hard cut immediately from the sight of Dario's naked ass to Melisandre topless in the bath.
Well, I thought that was interesting because it was a study in contrast between nudity being used as a quasi-humiliation versus it being used as an attempt to sort of empower the naked person, that I'm just comfortable like this. And
well, and it's also, if the power is in Dany's hands by being the clothed person who can order the other person to be naked, there is a kind of interesting inversion going on with Melisandre's scene in which she's naked and she's using her nakedness to put Selyse into a sort of a passive, submissive position in which, and that's weird because on the face of it, Selyse is a queen and Melisandre is one of her servants. But, beyond just kind of the on paper, the actual relationship here is that Selyse is completely in Melisandre's power.
Well, she's a devotee, not a, in the religious sense, which sort of is superseding, at least in her mind, the normal chain of command. I think.
Yeah, and there's something to it as well in that there's this kind of, if you look at the way that Selyse looks at Melisandre here, there's this weird combination of attraction and fear in that she's clearly kind of awed by this woman's body, and at the same time is afraid that she is going, that she's going to lose her husband, and and she's kind of, the religious thing is intersecting that with that in a weird, sort of cultish way, in the way that clearly under any other circumstance, Selyse would hate this woman and try to destroy her, but because of this religious sensibilities, she's rationalizing the fact that Melisandre fucked her husband, and especially Melisandre is using the religious thing so that, the way that she's interacting with a woman that she slept with is very whose husband she slept with is very unusual. There's not even discomfort, let alone kind of fear of the other person. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think it's a way of asserting control over a situation, and honestly, her whole speech sort of reminded me of a Penn and Teller routine, right? Where I'm going to tell you how the magic is done in order to make you believe that I have some real magic.
And what it kind of reminded me of was sort of a study in cognitive dissonance, in the same way that kind of salesmen and magicians work, that she's starting with kind of this thing about jokes and truth and lies that lead to the truth, and getting Selyse to buy into bigger and bigger sacrifices. As a stepping stone towards, what is sort of intimated as the future sacrifice of her daughter.
Yeah. And one of the people I was watching the show with, who's not a book reader, um, I think his response was, "She better slap that bitch," because I think she just threatened her kid. Like, because it really, to non-book readers, what seems to be going on there is, I think, more obvious to us. I was actually a little. I was trying to figure out what Melisandre was up to right there, and how this ties in with other things that happen as book readers
Mm-hmm.
know. But then we return to Marine.
Yeah, and Jorah is sort of almost smacked in the face with the
Walk of shaming Dario.
yeah, although clearly Dario has no shame whatsoever. Um, and we shouldn't execute the masters en masse. That, you know, instead you should understand, uh, you should take a more moral, relativistic sense of things and attempt peaceful negotiations. And Dany kind of executes an interesting power play here in that, she slightly changes the mission. They're still going to retake Yunkai, but they'll at least give diplomacy a chance, and I'll give you this one-up on Dario. And, Daenerys is not a stupid person. I don't think it slipped her mind that Jorah would probably run into Dario on his way into the meeting. And given how sort of possessive and controlling Jorah has been in the past, it's kind of an interesting management sort of system in that, like, she's taking him down a notch, but then giving him a bonus. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean it's a strange scene because she starts off and ends it with these whole series of binaries. Like, this is the way it's going to be. I'm asserting my power. This is what I'm going to do. And then Jorah talks her into having a more subtle approach. And then she immediately turns it back into a binary, right? They can live in my new world or they can die in their old one.
Right.
Because for her, even granting other people any sort of agency, she still wants to control the terms of that agency, set them out
I
as
mean,
one or the other.
yes
So,
and no. I mean, ultimately we're dealing with a situation in which a city that she liberated has revolted against her and turned to slavery. So, a certain amount of the relativism here is kind of rings a little bit false. Like the whole thing about, well, I was a slaver, and if, Ned Stark had done to me, and I'm sort of like, well, okay, but that could also be an argument that you should maybe be put to death. That maybe you deserve to be put to death because you sold people into slavery.
I mean, he was counting on the emotional connection he has with her on a
Yeah.
personal level to make sure that she came to a different conclusion.
Right.
Which is, and then she did come to a slightly different conclusion.
Yeah.
Made her look a little more pliable. I'm just saying I don't think she really is. I think we're moving into, without any spoilers, the era of Dany's bad governance, and we're starting to get hints of it here.
Yeah, we'll have to see how they do this going forwards, because this is slightly departing from the books, and I'm not exactly sure where things are going, especially with, for example, Hizdar now being her ambassador, where they're exactly going with this plotline. But we'll see. So, moving on, the Hound thinks that fire is bad.
Yeah, no, it was a revelation. I mean, he seemed to like it so much at Blackwater Bay. Now, I think this clearly is another scene meant to build up the mountain as not just a sort of physical beast, but a moral. And
yeah, I mean, it's been like what, 2 seasons since the Hound was kind of talking to Sansa about this, and
apparently he can only tell the Stark children.
Yeah, and so they kind of, now that they've re-brought in the Mountain, they need to remind folks, because it's been 3 seasons now since, he was chopping horses' heads off, that this guy is a monster, and in more than just a physical sense, that he does monstrous things to people. And, it's, it's slightly strange because, in the books, he tells this story to Sansa, not to Arya. And they sort of changed that in season 1, and now it's slightly strange to see them have the same scene, or a very similar scene, with Arya instead. I understand the larger reasons why they're doing that, but it does feel a little bit strange as someone who's read the books.
Yeah, but I think emotionally it worked. Also,
yeah, no, I'm not disagreeing.
Take care of him, and him allow her to.
Right.
Is another big moment for these two. But it's also, again, another little reminder of who Arya Stark is, especially right before the next scene with our next adventuring couple, Brienne and Pod.
Where they encounter a waiter who just won't shut the fuck up.
And, I get that they liked the pie, but Pod must have had some sort of look on his face that communicated, please, God, sit down and tell me all about the pie. Should I give up on the gravy? No, you should not give up on the gravy. Right?
I think partly it's just like, this is how... Have you ever run across someone who was really good at something, but clearly that was really the only thing that they were into, so they just didn't have an off switch for it? And I think it's like, this is like having an expert barista who will talk to you about 30 minutes about coffee beans when you were just sort of trying to be nice, or someone who decides to sit down at your table and tell you all about the ingredients of your meal. And you can see Brienne kind of gets a look on her face that her good intentions have clearly gone awry. But it's also kind of interesting in that when Brienne brings up the story of Sansa Stark, that Pod presents it as, this is a dangerous thing, you shouldn't be doing this. But at the end of the day, just as Arya was sort of ultimately rewarded for her kindness by making a friend in the form of hot pie, that here Brienne is being rewarded for sort of being open-hearted, with getting the first actual evidence that Arya Stark is alive and where she might be.
And and she gets that nice little line in with I forget what it was. Basically, it was "I told you so."
I think she said something along the lines of, "This is where I'd normally say I told you so."
Oh yeah, but it was a great little moment because Pod has actually been asserting himself more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And he telling her, informing her what all these banners mean and who's what and who's what, and just a little reminder that the relationship is not fully equal. And then we get the Arya Stark and the sort of an explicit comparison of Arya to Brienne, which is actually something I hadn't really thought about before. Arya doesn't seem to be growing up into being that kind of a warrior, but we can talk about that. That's book stuff.
I think in the sense that, two characters in the series who have never quite been able to sort of perform femininity, who at the same time sort of still are women and still kind of insist that they are women, who their gift in life is this, masculinized world of swordplay. So, there is something to that.
Yeah, it's just something that had never occurred to me. Again, book readers know why. Brienne is more like the Mountain than she is like Arya.
What?
Well, just in terms of gigantic.
Well, yeah, I mean,
That's not the
she's
kind of fighter that.
tall,
Yeah.
but at the same time, like, Arya's sort of running nickname in childhood was Arya Horseface. You know, she's always, neither of them have ever been able to assume the sort of the role of a lady that, say, Sansa, can very easily live inside that role.
Yeah.
Anyway, moving on. The third scene of Tyrion's play, and honestly, a rather tour de force on Pedro Pascal's part, as Oberyn arrives and gives this sort of backstory.
And if Dinklage was going to win an Emmy for his work last week, he might have some competition after this.
Well, what's interesting is I thought Dinklage was also amazing in this scene, but in a much quieter role. It's not the kind of acting that gets you Emmys, but his reaction to Oberyn's speech was really impressive.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. In part because it begins with sort of Tyrion not realizing he thought he had been orchestrating all of this, and it turns out he wasn't the playwright. If this is a little 3-act play, someone else had been writing it the whole time, and then actually he realizes that someone wrote it better than he was going to.
I don't think that metaphor works particularly.
Well, you think Tyrion?
I don't think Tyrion thought he was in control of this situation. I mean, he's been grasping at straws in both of the two scenes before this. So I don't think he thinks of himself as the playwright here.
I think he thought one of them would take, and then he has no idea why Oberyn's visiting him.
Yeah, and the Oberyn kind of comes at it obliquely with starting with this position, like starting by saying your sister came to me and was trying to sway me, which doesn't exactly start off on the foot of I might help you. And especially when he's talking about, a Lannister with my enthusiasm for dead Lannisters. Tyrion's a Lannister. He's got every reason to want to see Tyrion dead. And
then you were a disappointment. And it's like, oh, yeah, we're excited.
The great thing about that speech is, we talked about in the first episode of this season, the relationship between Oberyn and Tyrion has not exactly been one of respect. That Tyrion has tried very hard to be respectful, and that Oberyn has given him the brush off. And here there's sort of an intimation that, in a sense, this was cover. That when Oberyn, when Tyrion was a baby, that Oberyn had clearly made a decision that this person is a human being, worthy of being treated fairly and decently. And that, as someone who cares about justice, that he's essentially decided that Tyrion's case is close enough to his case to warrant being helped.
I agree. I mean, I think I was arguing earlier that I thought there was more mutual respect between them than you had, and I was going to go, haha, I told you so, but you beat me to it. But yeah, I think Oberyn had been planning, or as soon as he saw the opportunity arise, he already had, his sympathies were already organized around Tyrion, and Tyrion as somehow different from other Lannisters. And then this story just hammers home exactly why.
Right.
Why he would have had that. He wants justice, and that's what he said right outside of the whorehouse, Littlefinger's whorehouse as well, is that he wants justice, and now he's figured out how to get it.
And I like the way that they explained that, where he sort of says, I'm interested in justice, and, Tyrion says, well, then you've come to the wrong place, and he says, well, no, I haven't. Everyone who's wronged me is around me.
Into the lion's den.
Yeah.
I apologize for that.
Yeah. So, Tyrion has his champion. And in 2 weeks, we are going to get the showdown between the Viper, the Red Viper, and the Mountain.
Yes, we will. And that they could go make a big departure from the books here. I'm just saying. Because...
Don't say anything. Let's move on. Sansa momentarily steps into the movie Frozen.
Yes.
And decides to build a snow castle.
And a little Winterfell, and then Robin, being the little shit that he is, only wants to know where the moon door is.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is like he goes through a couple different phases here, where like initially he seems like isolated and neglected, in the sense that like he clearly doesn't know how to deal with other people. And you can sort of get Sansa, you can see Sansa understanding this when he's sort of talking about, well, how do you make people fly? And, when we get married, we can make people fly. And she's like, okay, this dude's nuts. He just does not, he's never been outside the Eyrie. I mean, Robin outright comes and says that the outside world is dangerous. He's never left. And then, he kind of clumsily damages the snow castle, and in a very childlike way, she's smiling while she's saying it. She's clearly not that angry. She says, well, you've ruined it. I'm going to have to start all over again. And Robin immediately goes off the handle. And, Sansa, in a very satisfying moment, really, I mean, the first moment that she's ever been able to lash out at anyone in a long time, smacks him right across the chops.
And everyone enjoyed it. The best slap on the show since Joffrey. Or since Tyrion slapped Joffrey. Or no, maybe some of the Cersei ones were nice too. But then we see that Littlefinger observed the whole thing.
Right.
And then we have this incredibly creepy conversation.
Yes. And he starts off by saying, sometimes you have to demolish the old to build a better, new world, and that's kind of creepy because at the end of the day, like, they're talking about the castle that in part is in ruins because of him. And then
it calls to mind what Varys was saying. Yeah, about the kind of person Littlefinger is. He wants to play with the ashes.
I think he said he would be king.
Yeah.
King of the Ashes or something like that. And then she sort of asks him why he killed Joffrey. And it's interesting. She clearly doesn't believe his previous answer. So it's good to see her kind of pushing. And he starts with, and there's a tension in his response, which is, on the one hand, he says, I loved your mother. If we lived in a better world, you would be my daughter. And then starts to make out with her.
Yeah. You might have been my child. Let's get to second base. I mean, it was...
Yeah, and, I think that's supposed to speak to something, and it's, by the way, very clear in the scene, Sansa is not into this. This is freaking her out.
Yeah.
But it speaks to a tension in Peter Baelish, which is, on the one hand, right, part of him believes that Catelyn Stark loved him, and that Sansa should have been his daughter, and that in a better world, she would have been. And at the same time, he is the person responsible for the death of most of the Stark household, including Catelyn Stark. He didn't just start the war. He deliberately involved her. He was the one who said, let's send a letter to Catelyn. He was the one who told Catelyn Tyrion was the one who sent this dagger. And so, in a sense, he's someone who's trying to have his cake and eat it too, which is that ultimately Catelyn rejected him. And so, on the one hand, he gets to punish her for that by destroying her family. And now he gets Catelyn version 2.0, who he knows is more beautiful and is, importantly, the same age that Catelyn was when she rejected him way back when. So there's something very deep, there's a deep fucked up tension here.
There is, and I'm trying to. As you were describing it, something else popped into my head, which are very similar. I'm thinking it's one of those Gene Wolfe novels in which someone does something very similar, destroys a person's entire home, family, probably planet, given that it's Gene Wolfe, uh, all in order to impress the daughter of the woman he loved, because he's got a second chance now. And I'm not remembering. Maybe someone listening does, because it could drive me nuts now that I can't remember what it is. But the reason I thought that was interesting is that um, it actually makes Varys' statement right. He is literally willing to be king of the Ashes, even, and as his queen, he will take his consolation prize, and he's okay with it, right? I mean,
Well,
because
and not only is he okay with it, he's kind of looking forward to it in the sense that this is classic grooming behavior.
yeah,
He is testing her limits. He is trying to mold her into exactly what he wants, no matter what the consequences are to her. Because as we see in the very next scene, for someone who's supposedly a mastermind, he's playing very fast and loose with Sansa's life here.
well,
where, Lysa oversees them.
Before we get to that, there's that great moment, which I swear to God was right off of like Dark Shadows or something, where the camera moved from the two of them to
Yeah.
Lysa's up there looking at from
and then scurries away.
Yeah, it was so over the top. I mean, it's perfectly in keeping with her character as sort of someone whose development has been arrested. She has the moral sensibility of a 13-year-old, but it was just, I actually laughed when I saw it.
Yeah, well, I think it was supposed to, there was a certain element of, tension breaking there.
Yeah, and you knew what was coming next as soon as
Yeah.
Um,
and, Lysa has her paranoid freak out and really, has Sansa on the edge of going over the moon door.
And it's just in a way it's recapitulating what Robin just did. Let's talk more about the moon door. We're going to talk about the moon door. You want to talk about the moon door? Do you know what happens when you go through the moon door? And it's fascinating what happens when bodies fall from such heights.
Right. And I kind of wish that they had done what they did in the books, which is have her kind of confession moment that she's been responsible for all of this all along here instead of in 2 episodes previously.
Yeah, I think it was 2 episodes ago.
But at the same time, the bit where Peter is kind of carefully luring her away from Sansa, and then I mean, in an act that really only a psychopath, not a psychopath, a sadist would do. He's going to kill her. He knows that from the moment he steps into the room. But the fact that he takes the time to let her know that he has never loved her at all, so that's the last thing that she's thinking about as she's on that long fall down onto the top of the mountain.
Well,
that's
but
fucking cold.
As I said earlier, in the episode, if you're going to kill someone, you go for the heart.
Yep. I like that.
I only loved one woman, only one my entire life, your sister. That's exactly what he goes for. And then out she flies. And poor Robin didn't even get to see it. Someone got to fly and Robin wasn't there. He almost feels bad.
I wonder how he's going to react to the news that his mommy went out the moon door. And for one thing, he's going to have to switch to solids now.
He's probably going to be excited first that just somebody flew, then pissed that he didn't get to see it. Maybe then it might register that, it was his mother.
Well, I mean, his mother has been the dominant force in his life. I think there's going to be a slight element of unmooring here.
Yeah, which should be fun to see, too. As awful as he is, he sort of proves those who say that this show has gotten casting of children better than almost anything I could think of. Robin is despicable. Joffrey, we need not even say. Arya, Bran. I mean, all of these. They've just done such a good job at casting children. And anyone who knows who watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer knows, there's not necessarily an easy thing to do, right? It's really easy to cast actors and actresses who seem like they're going to work but don't.
Mm.
But I mean, Robin is perfectly and wonderfully despicable.
Yeah.
I could hate on.
I think we're done.
I think we are, and we're done. Thank you, Memorial Day. No, we support the troops. No, it's a good holiday. All holidays are good. God damn it. No Game of Thrones.
Also, hey, look, for the health of the show, we don't want to have happen what happened with season 2, which is that they put all of their money into Blackwater.
Yeah.
And it took a massive ratings hit because no one was watching. So, I would rather that the big moments of the next 3 episodes happen when everyone is around to watch.
I agree, but this show is not in the situation it was in season 2 anymore. I mean, between the ratings and the download, which HBO is considering part of the ratings because they're progressive in that way, this show is HBO at this point. So I don't think there would be quite the ratings hit. But I'm looking forward to the next episode, and I guess we'll talk to you in 2 weeks.
Yep.
All right. This has been another Lawyers Guns Money podcast. I'm Scott R. Kaufman.
I'm Steve Atwell.
We'll talk to you in 2 weeks.
Bye-bye.